Good evening, everyone. It's July 4th, and I'm in Washington, D.C., uh, here to take part in the annual Ayn Rand Institute's Objectivist Conference. For people that aren't too familiar with Ayn Rand and what OCON is about, it's essentially a bunch of Ayn Rand fans that get together every year. This year, about 450 people, I believe, to here to celebrate her work, her history, her philosophy. A lot of it about being rational, being honest, celebrating individual heroism. And this is my first time here. And I thought it was fitting because it's July 4th weekend. We're in Washington, D.C. And it's very fitting because Ayn Rand really loved America. I thought it was one of the best examples of freedom anywhere in history. She once said that the greatest, the noblest, and its original founding principles, America is the only moral country in the history of the world. I tend to agree. With that. I've lived in a couple places around the world, and while I haven't lived in a lot of places, I'm fairly familiar with where I've lived and what I've read about, and I'd like to still think America is, despite its flaws, probably still the best place to live, not only economically, but in terms of freedom and its potential and its energy. And I can't agree with her more. Like I said, this is my first conference here, and I've met a lot of new people. I'm not very familiar with the community, but it's been exciting so far. And one of the things they have traditionally every year is they read the Declaration of Independence. People go up on stage and read verses, and I volunteered to read today. And it kind of got me thinking that I wanted to read the whole thing and record myself and be able to share it. If people are not familiar, there's the actual Declaration of Independence exists. I saw it a couple of days ago at the National Archive. It's when you walk in, it's on I believe it's on the second floor. It's in a grand rotunda, and you walk in, and under glass, there's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and I believe the Bill of Rights was there as well. It was quite amazing. I'm pretty sure I've been there before, but I just couldn't recall. I had to call my father earlier this morning and ask him if he brought me there when we were much younger, and he also didn't recall. But regardless, later in my life, I go there on my own and see it. It's quite an amazing thing to witness. It's also good to see the amount of people, particularly young people, that was fascinated in trying to take time to read it, ask their parents or the teacher that they were there with on field trip about what the Declaration of Independence is about. So it was good to see that. It's good to see curious minds taking time to think seriously about one of the founding documents for one of the best countries in civilization and history. And as I stated before, I wanted to take some time to record and read the Declaration of Independence. I've read it a few times before. I actually have one of those pocket constitutions that you probably hear a lot of people brag about. I'm not bragging about it, but I have one, and I've read it a few times. But I know a lot of people might not have had the chance to read it recently, so I thought give a chance to just read it on audio, and you can follow along with me and hear it yourself. I'm reading this straight from the archives.gov, so it's technically the original translation, and here it says in the note, is a transcription of the stone engraving of the parchment. I think I also saw that in the National Smithsonian American History Museum. I believe they have some of the actual engravings, the copper engravings there for you to watch, see yourself. That was quite amazing as well. So let's go on. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just destructive of these ends. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for the future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purposes of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. That's funny. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with many firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice, by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without consent of our legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has obtained with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to the acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it as once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by their ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And see below, you see all the representatives from the colonies who signed the document. And there's the famous John Hancock. If you're not familiar with who John Hancock was, that's the person that had the big signature down the middle. Well, every time I read this, it's a good reminder of how revolutionary and amazing this document is. Imagine 250 years ago, what kind of nation, what kind of intellectuals outside these people here publicly stated these thoughts and advocated for these thoughts in their own country, in their own territories, in their own communities. I mean, it's quite an amazing feat that we have these savage immigrants from Great Britain being able to come up with a document this as perfect as it could have been for the time. Now, if you read some of the details of the grievances, if you're a close observer, you might find some of it ironic. I mean, 250 years later, we filed these grievances against Great Britain to be free from them, and some of these grievances now we impose on ourselves. So it's not as bad, but you can see that we started with a great pretense, and slowly it's become eroded. But regardless, I'm still optimistic. We do have these kind of declarations embedded into our founding documents. It's part of our American culture. It's part of our American history. And most countries do not have this. So at least we always have a reference. And that keeps me optimistic that we'll try to honor these as close as best we can. Thank you very much. Have a good day.